They thought cutting me out of my sister's wedding would leave me humiliated and alone. What they didn't know was that I had been quietly collecting every lie, every forged paper, every piece of the truth they thought they had buried. While they posed for perfect pictures under the chandeliers of the Rosewood estate, plans were already moving that would shake the image they worked so hard to protect. And I'd be thousands of miles away in Barbados, warm sand under my feet, the ocean breeze on my skin, and my fiancé Daniel leaning in with that quiet smile that told me we'd already won in the only way that mattered. I was sitting at the end of the long oak dining table in my parents' Santa Barbara home, staring at the faint ring left by a coffee cup on the polished surface. My mother Margot was directly across from me, her back straight, hands folded neatly in front of her, as if she were about to start a board meeting instead of a family conversation. My father Robert sat beside her, silent the way he always was when she had decided the outcome of something. Ava, my younger sister, lounged in her chair like it was a throne, her lips curled in that slow, smug smile that had grated on me since we were kids. Margot's voice was cool and measured when she said it. "You won't be attending the wedding, Claire. We've decided it's for the best." The words floated across the table like ice water, and for a second I thought I had misheard. I blinked, trying to catch up to what she had just said. My fingers tightened on the edge of my chair, but I kept my face still. I asked why, even though I already knew what was coming. Ava gave a little laugh, like she had been waiting for that question. She leaned forward, elbows resting on the table in a way she knew Margot hated but never corrected. "You just wouldn't fit the atmosphere we're going for. Ethan's family has a certain standard. We want the day to be polished." The pause before that last word was deliberate, her eyes meeting mine in that unspoken way she had of reminding me where she thought I stood. Robert shifted in his seat but didn't look at me. Margot picked up the thread again. "This is not personal," she said, which made it sound even more calculated. "You've chosen a different path in life, and while we respect that the wedding will be a very formal affair, we don't want any tension on such an important day." The heat rose in my chest, but I held it there, refused to let it spill out. Different path. That was her delicate way of saying she thought my life didn't measure up. Ava's engagement to Ethan Callahan, whose family owned half of the waterfront real estate in Montecito, had sent her into a new stratosphere in their eyes. I could already picture the guest list, all those last names my parents loved to drop at dinner parties, the photographers they'd accidentally invited. And me, I was the mismatch in the picture they were trying to paint. I glanced at my father, hoping for the smallest sign that he didn't agree with this. His eyes stayed on the table, his jaw tight. It was as good as a signed endorsement of what Margot had just said. Ava's smile widened. "In fact, I already gave your invitation to someone who will really appreciate it." Her voice was light, almost playful, but I heard the blade underneath. My stomach tightened and I forced my hands to relax in my lap. "Who?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Her eyes sparkled. "Jenna Hart. You remember Jenna, right? My maid of honor. She's been dying to come. This way we can give her an extra +1. Her tone was all sugar, but every word landed like a pinprick. For a moment the room seemed to shrink. I thought of the last time I'd seen Jenna at a fundraiser years ago, clinging to Ava's side like a shadow. I could imagine her sliding into my seat at the ceremony, laughing with my parents, soaking in the glow of belonging that they had always denied me. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood. "So, that's it then," I said, my voice even. Margot's expression didn't change. Ava reached for her water glass as if she had just finished a pleasant conversation and was moving on to the next. I stood and smoothed the front of my dress, my mind already spinning in a different direction. I wasn't going to plead. I wasn't going to ask them to reconsider. The three of them had made their decision, and for the first time in a long time I saw it for exactly what it was. This wasn't about the wedding, it was about control. And I had just decided they wouldn't have it anymore. As I walked toward the door, the air in the house felt heavier than when I came in, the scent of Margot's lilies, cloying and sweet. I could feel Ava's eyes on my back, waiting for me to turn and give her the reaction she wanted. I didn't. I kept moving my heels, clicking against the floor, steady and deliberate. When I stepped outside, the afternoon sun hit my face warm and sharp. My car was parked at the edge of the long driveway, half hidden by the hedges. I got in without looking back at the house. My hands were steady on the wheel, but under the calm, something had shifted. They had no idea what they had just set in motion. I drove down the long stretch of Sycamore Road with the windows down, letting the late afternoon wind tangle my hair. The ocean shimmered in the distance, a perfect Santa Barbara postcard, but my mind was nowhere near the water. It drifted back uninvited to the years when I learned exactly where I stood in my family's hierarchy. Ava had been the golden child from the moment she could walk. My mother praised her curls, her smile, her grades, while every compliment to me came wrapped in comparison. Ava's more photogenic. Ava's grades are just a little higher. Ava carries herself like a lady. I was told to try harder, to not be so sensitive, to be more like her. I worked twice as hard in school and still watched her get rewarded for showing up. The memories bled into one another, but there were moments that stayed sharp. Like the Christmas I was 17 when I was offered a used set of sketch pencils while Ava unwrapped a diamond bracelet. Or the time my mother told a neighbor I had inherited my father's practical looks and Ava had my mother's beauty. I laughed along at the time, but I remember how my cheeks burned. When my grandfather, Henry Whitmore Sr., died in 2018, it should have been a turning point. He had always been kinder to me than anyone else in the family. He came to my art shows in high school, sent me books he thought I'd love, and never once compared me to my sister. His estate was valued at over $4.8 million. I knew he intended to leave something to each of us, but when the will was read, my name was nowhere. I remember sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of his lawyer, hearing the words, and feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. Margot was sitting 2 chairs away, her hand resting lightly on Ava's arm. Robert avoided my eyes. The will, they said, had been updated just months before his death. Everything apart from a few charitable donations went to my parents and Ava. At first I wanted to believe it. That maybe he had his reasons. But then I remembered Sophie Miller. She had been my mother's closest friend for years, almost like an aunt to me when I was little. We lost touch when I went away for college, but I saw her again at the funeral. She hugged me for a long time and whispered something strange in my ear. "It's not right, Claire." I saw the papers. I didn't ask her what she meant then. The funeral had been a blur of faces and flowers, and Sophie disappeared before I could pull her aside. But months later, I found out what she had seen. She had been at the house the day my parents and Ava met with a notary, supposedly to finalize some estate paperwork. She told me she'd seen a stack of documents and one of them bore my grandfather's signature, but it looked off. She hadn't said more, but the weight in her eyes told me enough. The first real crack in their version of events came the spring after his death. I had access to a joint family account for emergencies. My grandfather had set it up years ago with the understanding that it would be equally available to both me and Ava. One morning I logged in to pay a dental bill and the balance read 0. At first I thought it was a bank error. I called, but the representative told me the funds had been withdrawn in full 2 weeks earlier. The transaction required signatures from the account holders and, according to the bank, they had been provided. My name was on the paperwork, but I had never signed a thing. I drove to the branch, demanded to see the withdrawal forms. The woman behind the counter looked uneasy as she handed me a copy. My signature was there in thick black ink, and for a moment I felt dizzy. It was a near-perfect imitation, but I could see the differences. The curve of the R in my last name, the way the tail of the E dipped too low. My parents' names were there as well, along with Ava's. All 4 signatures. When I confronted Margot, she acted offended. "It was a joint account, Claire. We decided to close it. You were barely using it." As if that justified forging my name. Robert said nothing as usual. Ava smirked from her seat at the counter, swirling her iced latte like this was all a show she'd seen before. That was when something in me shifted. I stopped trying to explain myself to them. I kept my distance, but I also started paying attention. Every comment, every purchase, every slip in their stories I stored away like pieces of a puzzle. Now, driving away from that meeting at the house, I realized I still had a few of those pieces. Old statements. Notes from conversations I had written down in the moment. And Sophie, somewhere out there holding a memory that might be the key to everything. The sun was dipping lower, streaking the sky in orange and pink. I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, sitting in the quiet for a moment. The house felt cooler when I stepped inside, my cat winding around my legs. I dropped my bag on the counter and poured a glass of water, staring at the condensation sliding down the glass. If Margot and Ava thought excluding me from their perfect little wedding would be the end of it, they had forgotten one thing. I had learned from them. I knew how to wait. And I knew how to keep my hands steady until the right moment came. When Daniel came home that evening, I was still sitting at the kitchen island with my laptop open but untouched. He walked in carrying the faint smell of sea air from his late afternoon run, his hair still damp at the edges. The moment he saw my face, he dropped his gym bag and crossed the room. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but steady. I told him everything from the moment I stepped into my parents' house to the moment I pulled into our driveway. I didn't leave out the details about Ava's smirk, Margot's measured tone, or Robert's silence. Daniel listened without interrupting, only shifting once to pour us both a glass of water. When I finished, I expected him to try to calm me down, to tell me it wasn't worth the fight. Instead, he leaned against the counter and looked at me like he was sizing up an opponent. "Then we go after them," he said. It wasn't a question. Daniel had built his own tech company from the ground up and had the scars to prove it. Years ago, he had been dragged through a brutal legal battle with a former shareholder who tried to take control. He knew what it meant to fight someone who thought they had all the leverage. He also knew the value of having the right people on your side. I told him about Sophie, about the forged signature on the bank forms, and about my grandfather's will being changed. His eyes sharpened when I mentioned the paperwork. "You still have anything concrete?" he asked. I hesitated, then got up and walked to the small storage cabinet in the hallway. I pulled out a metal lockbox, the kind that could be mistaken for holding old receipts and nothing else. Inside, under a stack of unrelated papers, was a black USB drive. I set it on the counter between us. "I found this 2 years ago in Dad's home office," I said. He left his laptop open while he was on the phone. I saw a folder labeled Estate Files and copied everything onto this before he came back. I didn't know what I was looking at then, but some of it looked off. Daniel picked it up like it was made of glass. "You've never opened it," I shook my head. I didn't want to do it on my computer in case there was something sensitive. He went to his office and came back with his own laptop, one he used for nothing but secure work. As he plugged in the drive, my heart thudded in my ears. The screen filled with folders, each named in my father's neat clinical style. Inside were scanned documents, emails, and transaction histories. Daniel clicked through, quickly scanning each page. After a few minutes, he stopped on a PDF of a will. The date in the corner was just 6 months before my grandfather died. It bore his signature, but Daniel zoomed in on the way the ink bled slightly, like it had been printed and then traced over. Then he opened a set of wire transfer receipts. Large sums moved from a trust account into one under my parents' names, some into Ava's. Each had a note referencing estate reallocation. My stomach turned. "This is good," Daniel said quietly. "Really good. But we need more. We need corroboration and an expert to say what we already know." He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact labeled Michael Torres. Michael was a corporate attorney in Los Angeles who had handled Daniel's shareholder case. If anyone could navigate both the legal and public sides of a fight like this, it was him. Daniel texted him to set up a meeting. I leaned back in my chair, the tension in my shoulders easing just slightly. For years, I had been holding on to anger without a way to direct it. Now it felt like the first step in an actual plan. Daniel sat down across from me, resting his forearms on the counter. "If we do this," he said, "we do it completely. No half measures. It will get ugly and they will hit back." "Are you ready for that?" I thought about Margot's cold eyes, Ava's smug smile, Robert's silence. I thought about Sophie's voice at the funeral and the forged signature on the withdrawal form. I nodded. "Good," he said, "because once we start, there's no going back." The room was quiet for a moment, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Daniel reached over and closed my laptop. "Tonight we eat," he said. "Tomorrow we start." I smiled faintly, but inside I was already moving through scenarios. I could picture the call to Sophie, the meeting with Michael, the steps that would follow. The USB sat between us like a fuse waiting to be lit. I didn't touch it again that night. It was enough to know it was finally out in the open, no longer just a secret I carried alone. The next afternoon, I drove across town to the Harborview Cultural Center for a charity art exhibition I had promised a colleague I would attend. The place was already buzzing when I arrived, the clink of champagne flutes and the low hum of conversation echoing against the vaulted ceilings. I was scanning the crowd when I spotted a cluster of people near the gallery's main display, their presence impossible to miss. Victoria Callahan was in the center, wearing a blush silk dress that caught the light every time she moved. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her pearls sat just so, and her laugh carried across the room. Beside her stood Ethan, tall and polished, and a man I recognized from a magazine profile as his father, Charles Callahan. I had seen them only in photographs Ava had posted, but, in person, their air of practiced elegance was unmistakable. I kept my distance at first, but the crowd naturally flowed in their direction. Soon I was within earshot, standing near a display of watercolor landscapes. Victoria was speaking to a small group of patrons about the wedding. She used words like breathtaking and flawless, and when someone asked about the guest list, she smiled with that careful charm I'd seen in society pages. "We are so blessed to be joining with the Whitmore family. They share our values and our vision." The words hit me harder than I expected. My parents had done their part well, presenting themselves as the perfect match for the Callahans. I forced myself to study her more closely. That was when I noticed the clasp on her pearl necklace had a small dent, like it had been repaired. The gold cuff on her wrist was bright, almost too bright, and the stones in her earrings caught the light in a way that looked synthetic. I had worked in enough boutique galleries to know rented pieces when I saw them. A server passed by with a tray, and as I reached for a glass of sparkling water, I heard Victoria lower her voice. She had stepped slightly away from the group phone pressed to her ear. I moved toward a painting of a sailboat, pretending to admire it while angling closer. "I told you the invoice would be settled by last Friday," she said, her tone clipped now. "We are finalizing some transfers. The delay is temporary. No, I cannot give you a new date yet." Her eyes flicked around the room, checking if anyone was listening. I drifted away before she noticed me, my mind turning over what I had just heard. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was something. The Callahans were supposed to be flush with old money and stable investments. If they were having trouble paying vendors for the wedding, it meant their image might be more fragile than it looked. I was studying a series of photographs when I felt my phone buzz in my bag. I stepped into a quieter corner near the rear exit and answered. Claire Sophie's voice came through, warm but urgent. "I think I found something." I felt my grip on the phone tighten. "What is it?" "Do you remember you asked me about your grandfather's will?" she said. I nodded instinctively, though she couldn't see me. I was cleaning out some old boxes in my attic and found a folder I forgot I had. It has photocopies from the estate planning documents, including what looks like an earlier version of the will. And Claire, your name is on it. For a second, the noise of the event faded. My heart thudded in my ears. "Are you sure it's real?" "It's dated 2 years before he died," Sophie continued. "The bequests are different, and there's a note in his handwriting about equal distribution to both granddaughters. I'm looking at it right now." I exhaled slowly, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Can we meet tomorrow afternoon?" she said. "My place is better. Too many eyes around town." I agreed, and we set a time. When I hung up, I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. For years the story had been that I was never in the will. Now there might be physical proof that I had been written in and erased. As I rejoined the main hall, Victoria was posing for a photo with a donor, her smile wide and bright again. I wondered if she had any idea how thin the ice beneath her was. If she and my family thought they could glide to that wedding without cracks showing they were wrong. I stayed long enough to make polite conversation with a few acquaintances, then slipped out into the cool evening. The air smelled faintly of salt from the harbor, and the lights from the pier shimmered on the water. My mind was already moving ahead to tomorrow, to Sophie's attic, to the folder that could change everything. By mid-morning, I was driving down the 101 toward Los Angeles, the folder from Sophie buckled into the passenger seat like precious cargo. I had barely slept, my mind running through possibilities, arguments, and the faces of everyone who had told me I was cut out of the will. Now I was on my way to meet Michael Torres, the attorney Daniel trusted most. His office was in a glass tower in Century City, all clean lines and quiet hallways that smelled faintly of leather and fresh coffee. Michael was already waiting in the conference room when I arrived. He stood, shook my hand firmly, and gestured for me to sit. Daniel had briefed me, he said as I slid the folder across the table. But I want to hear it from you. I told him about my grandfather's death in 2018, the sudden change to the will, and my parents' and Ava's involvement. I laid out the USB files and Sophie's photocopies, explaining how I had come across each piece. Michael's expression didn't change much, but I could see his mind turning over the details. He took a pen and tapped it lightly on the folder. If this earlier version of the will is authentic and we can prove the later one was forged or altered, we have grounds to reopen the estate case. That means every asset connected to the disputed inheritance could be frozen until the matter is settled. The idea of their accounts being locked mid-celebration was almost too satisfying. How soon could something like that happen? I asked. Michael leaned back. Timing is everything. If you want the maximum impact, you wait until the moment they least expect it. You said the wedding is in 3 weeks. 2.5, I corrected. Then that is your stage, he said. We file the petition and the emergency injunction the morning of. By the time the ceremony starts, the court order hits the banks. They get the news before they even cut the cake. A slow heat spread through me, part adrenaline, part vindication. I could see it so clearly, Margot's composure cracking, Ava's shock, the whispers spreading through the reception. But Michael's tone was sober as he continued. It will be public record the moment we file. The media can pick it up and you will be on the receiving end of their anger. You need to be prepared for that. I nodded. I had lived with their anger for years. This time it wouldn't matter. We talked through next steps, which included authenticating Sophie's copy of the will with a handwriting expert and cross-referencing the USB documents with bank records. Michael promised to coordinate with his forensic accountant and keep everything off the radar until the right moment. When I left his office, the midday sun was glaring off the glass towers, making the sidewalks shimmer. I pulled into a coffee shop a few blocks away to clear my head before driving back. The place was half empty, the kind of spot where no one looked twice at you for nursing a drink and staring at your phone. That was when the email came in. The sender was a string of random numbers and letters, no subject line. Normally, I would have deleted it, but something made me open it. Inside was a single sentence. Thought you might find this useful. Below it were 6 attached images. My pulse spiked as I opened the first one. It was a high-resolution photo of a bank statement in Robert's name showing a transfer of $200,000 into an account jointly held with Margot. The next was, in Ava's name, a series of deposits from the same source. All of them were marked with notes like estate reallocation and trust adjustment. I clicked through each image, my hands tightening on the phone. These weren't just rumors or suspicions, this was the paper trail. Whoever had sent them had access to internal banking documents down to the account numbers. I glanced around the cafe, suddenly aware of every sound, every movement. No one was paying me any attention, but I lowered the phone slightly as if to shield it. I forwarded the email to Daniel and then to Michael, marking it urgent. Within minutes, Michael replied, "This is gold." "Where did you get it?" "Anonymous," I typed back. "No idea who." "Keep it that way," he wrote. "Do not reply. We use it, but we never reveal the source." I locked my phone and sat back, staring out at the traffic crawling along the avenue. The plan we had discussed in that conference room had just shifted from possible to inevitable. And now, with this new ammunition, the strike would be cleaner and harder than I had imagined. I finished my coffee without tasting it, the noise of the espresso machine fading under the steady hum of my thoughts. The date was set in my mind, now not for their celebration but for their undoing. Daniel was home before me that evening, leaning against the kitchen island with his tie loosened and a faint smile that told me he had already made a decision. He didn't even ask about my meeting with Michael. He just poured me a glass of cold water and slid it across the counter. "We're not wasting another breath trying to get into that wedding," he said. "And we're definitely not staying in town to listen to the gossip." Something in the certainty of his tone made my shoulders drop for the first time that day. "Good," I said. "I'm done with it." "I was thinking we disappear," Daniel continued. "Not just skip the wedding. I mean, really vanish from their radar. No social media, no texts, nothing. They're expecting drama from you. Give them silence instead." "Where would we go?" I asked, though I could already hear the excitement in my own voice. His smile widened. "Barbados. I called in a favor with a client who owns a jet share. We can fly out that morning, land in time for lunch on the beach. 5-star resort, ocean view, private chef. I booked it before you got home." I laughed more from disbelief than anything else. "You booked it without even asking me?" He shrugged. "I knew you'd say yes, and if you didn't, I'd convince you. But something tells me you're not going to take much convincing." I tried to imagine the contrast: Ava walking down the aisle, the flowers, the champagne toasts, while I was half a world away, toes in the sand, letting the salt air wash the last traces of them out of my system. It felt cleaner than any confrontation ever could. After dinner, while Daniel took a call in his study, I went upstairs to my desk. The lamp cast a warm pool of light over a blank sheet of paper. I began writing to myself, not in the way you write a diary, but as if I were speaking to the version of me that would read it years later. I wrote about the ways I had bent myself to fit into their expectations, about the years I had kept quiet when I should have spoken, about the night Margot told me my place in the family was conditional. I wrote that leaving wasn't weakness. It was a choice to stop drinking poison just because it came from familiar hands. When the word slowed, I signed my name, folded the letter, and sealed it in an envelope. I tucked it into the top drawer, a private contract I intended to keep. The next morning I drove to my parents' house while I knew they'd be out. The key was still on my ring, smooth and heavy, a reminder of every time I had let myself in without being welcomed. The rooms were quiet, full of the faint scent of lemon polish. I didn't linger. In the kitchen, I placed the key on a folded dish towel on the counter. My fingers rested on it for a second before I turned away. In my old bedroom, the walls still held faint marks from where I'd once taped up posters. I opened the closet and pulled down the shoebox where I kept family photos. One by one, I slid the pictures from their frames: birthday, dinners, beach trips, Ava grinning with her arm hooked through mine. Even the ones where I looked happy went into the larger storage bin I'd brought with me. The glass from the frames clinked softly as I stacked them. When the bin was full, I carried it to my car and drove straight to a storage facility near the edge of town. The clerk barely looked up as I signed the paperwork for a small unit. Inside, the space was cool and dim. I set the bin in the far corner, closed the metal door, and locked it with the padlock they'd given me. The clang of the lock snapping shut echoed in my chest. By the time I got back, Daniel had the resort's website pulled up on his tablet. He pointed out the whitewashed villas lining a curve of turquoise water. "Look at this," he said. "We can walk straight from our room onto the sand. There's a private boat if you want to explore the reef. And the spa." It was the kind of place people went to start over. Before I could answer, his phone buzzed on the counter. He picked it up, glanced at the screen, and put it on speaker. Michael's voice filled the kitchen. "I've gone through everything you sent me. It's airtight. We could file tomorrow and have the injunction ready for the morning of the wedding." "Tomorrow?" I asked. Michael confirmed. "The sooner we get the court date locked in, the less chance they have to move assets. If we wait too long, they might catch wind. But right now they're not looking over their shoulders." Daniel and I exchanged a glance. It wasn't a decision that needed words. "Do it," I said into the phone. I could hear Michael's pen scratching as he made a note. "I'll handle the filings. Keep your plans exactly as they are. The less they suspect, the better." When the call ended, Daniel leaned back against the counter, his eyes fixed on me. 3 weeks from now, you'll be in the sun, and they'll be getting the news they can't buy their way out of." I felt a slow, steady calm spread through me. It wasn't the giddy rush of revenge. It was the weightless certainty that I no longer needed their approval, their company, or their name. The future I wanted was already waiting. and for the first time I could walk toward it without looking back. The alarm went off before the first streak of light touched the sky. Daniel was already up, moving quietly through the room, zipping my suitcase closed and setting it by the door. The air outside our bedroom was cool and still carrying that faint scent of morning in Los Angeles, when the streets are nearly empty. We moved in practiced silence, each of us knowing there was no need to talk about what came next. A black sedan pulled up in front of the house, the driver stepping out to load our bags. The ride to the private terminal took less than 30 minutes. Out the window, the city was still asleep, a scattering of lights fading into the distance as we headed toward the airport. I leaned my head against the glass, watching palm trees blur past my mind, already half a continent away. The terminal was quiet, the lighting soft, the polished floors reflecting the faint glow of dawn. A uniformed attendant greeted us by name and led us to a lounge where the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Through the tall windows, I saw our jet waiting on the tarmac, its sleek white frame gleaming under the early light. Daniel signed the final paperwork while I stepped outside onto the runway. The engines were idling, a low, steady hum that felt like the beginning of something inevitable. The steps to the cabin felt lighter than I expected. Once inside, the door closed with a soft seal and the cabin seemed to wrap around us in a cocoon of quiet luxury. As the engines roared to life and the jet began its takeoff roll, I let myself imagine what was unfolding up north. In Santa Barbara, the Rosewood estate would be stirring. Staff arranging the final floral arches, photographers adjusting lenses, the catering team rushing in trays of chilled champagne and tiered displays of hors d'oeuvre. Guests would be arriving in their pressed suits and pastel dresses, brushing cheeks, complimenting hats, rehearsing smiles for the inevitable photographs. Margot would be overseeing every detail, making sure the cameras caught her from her best angle, while Robert stood nearby, silent and solid, projecting the image of a proud father. Upstairs, Ava would be surrounded by bridesmaids, the silk of her gown spilling across a chair, her lips pursed in that faint smug curve I knew so well. She'd be certain this day was hers alone, untouchable. She would have no idea that downtown, in a courthouse miles away, Michael Torres was walking through a set of heavy glass doors with a leather briefcase in hand. Inside it, the culmination of weeks of work, bank statements showing transfers designed to hide money, property deeds altered to cut me out, signatures that would not stand up to forensic review. The filing was timed down to the minute, paired with an emergency motion to freeze every Whitmore and Callahan account. Somewhere between the California coastline and the first stretch of ocean, my phone buzzed. Michael's name appeared on the screen. Filing complete. Judge reviewing now. Asset freeze included. I passed the phone to Daniel, who read the message, his jaw tightening in quiet satisfaction. Good, he said, simply, then leaned back in his seat. We crossed over the gulf, the light shifting from pale silver to warm gold. The flight attendant served breakfast on porcelain plates, steam curling from the coffee cups. I took a bite of fruit, but found myself thinking about the estate again. By now, the guests would be settling into their chairs, a string quartet playing softly in the background. Somewhere out of sight, the Callahan family might already be feeling the first cracks in their perfect facade, though they wouldn't understand why yet. 2 hours later, another vibration from my phone pulled me from a half-doze. This time it was Sophie. They're here. My fingers flew over the screen. Who? Her reply came instantly. Police. Court officials. Walking up the main drive right now. Cameras everywhere. I stared at the words, the image forming in my mind so vividly I could almost hear the murmur of confusion from the guests, the sharp clicks of camera shutters. Officers in navy uniforms, their badges catching the sunlight, weaving through stunned clusters of people. Margot's polite mask cracking. Ava's perfect posture stiffening. Daniel read over my shoulder and exhaled slowly. Looks like the timing landed exactly where we wanted. The jet began its descent into Barbados, the ocean below glittering like glass. I tucked my phone into my bag. Whatever was unraveling back in California could continue without me. The wheels touched down with a smooth, steady thud. Warm Caribbean air rushed into the cabin as the door opened, carrying the scent of salt and hibiscus. Daniel took my hand as we stepped onto the tarmac, the sunlight spilling over us in a way that felt almost ceremonial. Somewhere thousands of miles away, my family's perfect day was being rewritten in real time. And I didn't need to be there to watch it happen. I only needed to know it was finally out of their hands. The heat wrapped around me the moment we stepped out of the black SUV and onto the cobblestone driveway of the resort. The entrance rows ahead, all whitewashed walls and sweeping archways framed by palm trees. A uniformed porter greeted us with chilled towels and glasses of guava juice, the kind of small gesture that made the whole world feel far away. Inside, the lobby opened into a view that looked like it had been painted. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond a terrace, lined with wicker chairs and flickering lanterns. The air smelled faintly of salt and frangipani. I could feel the knots in my shoulders start to loosen as we followed a concierge through the hallways toward our suite. The room was more than I expected. Floor-to-ceiling glass looked out over a crescent of beach where the water shimmered in shades of turquoise and pale green. A bottle of champagne sat on ice by the bed, 2 glasses already set beside it. A platter of fresh fruit, pineapple, mango, papaya, waited on the table, the sweetness filling the air. Daniel tipped the porter and closed the door behind us. For a moment, we just stood there letting the quiet settle. Then he walked over to the window, sliding it open so the sound of waves rushed in. I stepped out onto the balcony, my bare feet meeting warm tile, and leaned against the railing. Down below, guests were scattered on lounge chairs, waiters carrying trays of cocktails balanced on silver trays. We unpacked slowly, not because we needed the time, but because there was nothing to rush toward. By late afternoon, we had changed into lighter clothes and wandered down to the open-air restaurant just off the beach. The host led us to a table tucked near the edge of the deck where the breeze carried the smell of grilling lobster and herbs. Dinner was unhurried. We started with oysters drizzled in citrus, followed by platters of grilled snapper and lobster tails brushed with garlic butter. The wine was a crisp Sauvignon Blanc that caught the light in our glasses. Around us, other diners laughed over candlelit tables, the soft rise and fall of their voices blending with the low hum of a jazz trio playing in the corner. At some point, the waiter brought out a dessert we hadn't ordered, slices of mango and passion fruit with a thin drizzle of honey, compliments of the chef. I took a bite, the sweetness almost startling after the salt of the sea breeze. For the first time in years, I felt the kind of stillness that wasn't forced, the kind that didn't feel like waiting for something to go wrong. Daniel's phone lit up on the table. He glanced at the screen, swiped it open, and read without speaking. Then he slid it toward me. The message was from Michael. 4 words: the wedding was disrupted. I felt a warmth rise in my chest, not from the wine, but from the quiet certainty that everything was moving exactly as planned. I didn't need details. Not yet. The not knowing felt almost luxurious, like holding a wrapped gift you weren't in a hurry to open. Daniel reached for his glass, his eyes meeting mine over the flicker of the candle between us. He didn't have to say anything. The corners of my mouth curved into a smile, slow and steady, the kind that came when you knew a moment would stay with you for years. We lingered after the plates were cleared, listening to the final set from the musicians. The bass was low and steady, the piano spilling notes that seemed to float out over the water. When we finally stood to leave, the night had deepened, the stars sharp against the darkness. Back in the suite, I stepped out onto the balcony again. The tide had come in, smoothing the beach until it gleamed under the moonlight. Daniel uncorked the champagne, the soft pop echoing in the quiet, and poured 2 glasses. We clinked them lightly, the sound small against the crash of the waves. I took a sip, letting the bubbles break against my tongue, and turned toward the horizon. Somewhere far beyond it, the life I had known was folding in on itself, the weight of years of lies and greed finally shifting. Here, though, there was nothing but the warm night air, the steady sound of the sea, and the taste of victory just beginning to settle. The morning light spilled across the suite in soft gold, the curtains swaying gently with the breeze from the open balcony door. I was still in bed when Daniel came in from the terrace with his tablet in hand. He didn't say a word at first, just set it on the duvet in front of me. The headline was impossible to miss. Whitmore and Callahan assets frozen amid alleged fraud investigation. Beneath it, a photo of Rosewood Estate from the day before, the manicured gardens now crowded with men in dark suits carrying briefcases, a sheriff's car parked in the driveway. Another image showed Harold Callahan stepping out of the house, his face tight and pale while my father trailed behind, eyes fixed on the ground. I sat up, pulling the tablet closer. The article detailed the temporary restraining order on all major holdings pending review of fraudulent transfers and forged documents related to my grandfather's estate. The words made my pulse slow, like I was watching a long chain of dominoes finally fall. Daniel was already at the small dining table with his laptop open, switching between news outlets. It wasn't just one report. Local channels had live footage from outside the estate, while national outlets picked up the story with side-by-side comparisons of my family's public image and the allegations now in court filings. On one feed, a reporter stood in front of the gates, the faint hum of a generator behind her, as camera crews filmed every vehicle coming and going. I wrapped a robe around me and joined him. He clicked on a live stream, the camera catching a cluster of guests in formal wear leaving the estate in a hurry. Someone in the background said the reception had been cut short, that the band had stopped playing halfway through a song. Then came the part that made my breath catch. Social media had exploded overnight. The hashtags with my family's name were everywhere, but the posts weren't just about the investigation. People I had never met were sharing stories. A florist claiming Margot had refused to pay for a wedding years ago. A caterer who said Ava had berated his staff over appetizers. A former employee of Callahan Holdings describing how their retirement fund had been mishandled. The perfect image was unraveling in real time, and it wasn't just the law pulling at the threads. Every petty cruelty, every smug dismissal, every careless insult they had ever delivered to someone without power to fight back was surfacing, each one adding weight to the collapse. I scrolled through the comments, the voices blending into a chorus. Some were angry, some almost gleeful, others quietly relieved to see people like them finally face consequences. Daniel poured coffee for both of us and set my cup beside me. I watched the steam curl upward, thinking about how different this morning felt compared to the one I had imagined months ago when the wedding was first announced. Back then I thought I would be watching from a distance with bitterness, maybe even regret. Now there was only a clear, steady satisfaction. The live coverage cut to a shot of the sheriff's deputy posting notices on the estate gates. Behind him, Victoria Callahan was on the phone, pacing in heels that sank slightly into the gravel. Her voice was muffled, but her expression said enough. This was not how she had planned to greet the press. I leaned back in my chair, letting the voices from the television fade into the background. Outside, the ocean was calm, the sunlight catching on the water in shifting patterns. I thought about the years I had spent trying to win their approval, about how small I had allowed myself to feel under their scrutiny. That version of me seemed impossibly far away now. Daniel glanced up from his laptop and met my eyes. No words were needed. He closed the screen and reached for my hand, his grip firm, grounded. Whatever came next, the part that mattered most, had already happened. The truth was no longer something I carried alone in the shadows. It was out in the open, where it belonged. Somewhere in the distance, a seabird called out, the sound sharp and clean in the morning air. I lifted my coffee, took a slow sip, and let the warmth settle in my chest. The day was still young, but the shift had already happened. The weight that had been mine for so long was gone, and in its place was something far lighter, something I intended to keep. By the time our plane touched down in Los Angeles, the headlines had shifted from breaking news to ongoing coverage. The airport felt oddly quiet despite the hum of travelers, the kind of stillness that comes when you know the storm is still out there, but you've stepped into a different kind of air. Daniel drove us up the coast to Santa Barbara, the Pacific glinting silver under a sky the color of glass. I had already arranged to meet Sophie the next afternoon. The cafe was tucked into a side street away from the tourist strip, the kind of place where the clink of ceramic cups and the low murmur of conversation were the loudest sounds. Sophie was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her coat draped over the back of the chair. She stood when she saw me, her smile faint but warm, and for the first time in years I felt the comfort of seeing someone who knew the truth before it was public. We ordered coffee and settled in. Sophie didn't waste time. She leaned forward, her voice low but steady, and began recounting what she had pieced together over the years. Margot and Robert had been the ones to suggest changing the will after my grandfather died. Ava had been hesitant at first, worried about the legality, but the promise of security and control had been enough to draw her in. I listened, my hands around the warm mug, letting her words sink in. Sophie spoke of late-night conversations she had overheard, the times she had seen my father bring home envelopes from his attorney's office, the moments Margot had boasted about how no one would ever challenge us. When she reached into her bag and pulled out a plain white envelope, my breath caught. She slid it across the table. Inside was a letter written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. The paper was worn, the ink faded slightly, but the message was clear. He had wanted me to inherit the majority of his estate, citing my independence, my integrity, and the fact that he trusted me to preserve the family's values. I traced my finger over the signature, the familiar loops and flourishes I had seen on so many birthday cards and Christmas letters. A heaviness pressed at my chest, not from anger this time, but from the weight of knowing that his wishes had been buried under greed. Sophie's eyes softened. She told me she had kept the letter hidden all these years, afraid that revealing it too soon would make it disappear into the same void where the original will had gone. She thought now was the time. Daniel arrived halfway through, sliding into the chair beside me. I handed him the letter without a word. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable at first, then resolute. When he looked at me, there was no question in his eyes, only certainty. "This changes everything," he said quietly. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. It was Michael. I stepped outside to take the call, the cool ocean air rushing against my skin. His tone was brisk but steady. He told me the letter could be critical provided it was authenticated. He wanted it in his hands by the end of the day so his team could begin the process. It would become a centerpiece in the upcoming court filings, a direct counter to the forged documents my parents had relied on. When I went back inside, Daniel was talking with Sophie, his voice low but reassuring. We finished our coffee, and I promised Sophie she would be kept in the loop, that her part in this was more than I could repay. She just nodded as if she already understood. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk. Daniel took the envelope from me with the same care you'd give something fragile and irreplaceable. As we walked to the car, I felt the quiet click of another piece sliding into place. This wasn't just about legal strategy anymore. It wasn't even just about money. It was about the truth finally having a chance to stand on its own, with nothing to shield the people who had buried it. By the time we reached the parking lot, I looked at Daniel and knew without saying it that we were holding the final key. The fight ahead would be public and it would be ugly, but it would also be the last one. The morning of the verdict was cool and clear, the kind of Southern California day that seemed determined to pretend nothing bad ever happened here. I arrived at the courthouse with Daniel beside me and Michael walking just ahead, his leather briefcase swinging lightly in his hand. My heels clicked against the stone steps, each sound a reminder that this was no longer a private family matter. Every movement from this point on would be public record. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the beams. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded in front of me. Daniel took a seat directly behind, close enough that I could feel the steady presence of him without looking. Across the aisle, Margot adjusted the cuff of her blazer and avoided my eyes. Robert sat stiffly, his shoulders squared but his jaw set tight. Ava's gaze was fixed on the tabletop, her hair perfectly curled in that deliberate, effortless way she favored for photographs. Behind them, Harold Callahan looked like a man counting the exits. The judge entered and we all rose. The scrape of chairs echoed in the tall room. I could feel the tension stretching between our tables like a live wire. My pulse was calm, almost unnervingly so. I had spent weeks preparing for this, years if I counted the slow accumulation of every slight, every dismissal, every carefully veiled insult that had led us here. Michael began his closing argument with the same measured tone he'd carried throughout the trial. He walked the judge through the timeline: my grandfather's death in 2018, the sudden change to the will, the forged signatures verified by a handwriting expert, the bank transfers into accounts that should never have existed. He spoke of intent, of opportunity, of the harm caused by calculated deceit. The defense tried to counter with talk of misunderstandings, clerical mistakes, and strained family dynamics. But as their attorney spoke, I saw the judge glance down at the authenticated letter from my grandfather, his words in ink that had outlasted all their schemes. When the judge began reading her decision, the room went still. She acknowledged the strength of the evidence, the clear pattern of fraudulent activity, and the deliberate exclusion from the will. She ordered the estate to restore my rightful inheritance, $1.6 million, plus accrued interest and the return of specific real estate holdings improperly transferred to other family members. Furthermore, an injunction would prevent the sale or encumbrance of those properties without my consent. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to split the air. For a moment, I didn't move. I felt Daniel's hand on my shoulder, warm and grounding. Michael leaned in and murmured, "Congratulations, Claire. You won." But the words barely registered. What I felt was not triumph so much as the deep, quiet relief of something finished. We exited into a hallway lined with reporters and camera crews. The flashbulbs popped the air thick with overlapping voices calling my name. Michael stepped forward, giving a brief statement about justice and the importance of truth while I kept my gaze ahead and moved toward the doors. Daniel stayed close, a protective barrier between me and the crowd. Outside, the sunlight felt sharper, the air carrying the scent of eucalyptus from the trees lining the street. We descended the courthouse steps slowly. Daniel caught my eye, his mouth curling into a small smile before he said that we should use part of the money for a scholarship in my grandfather's name. Something lasting. Something untouched by them. The idea lodged in my chest, steady and solid. We reached the car and I finally looked at my phone. There were dozens of messages from friends, acquaintances, and strangers who had followed the case. But one stood out, Sophie. I opened it. Just 6 words: they canceled the honeymoon. Attached was a screenshot of an email Ava had sent to a mutual acquaintance complaining that their credit cards had been declined and all accounts frozen pending the investigation into Harold Callahan's finances. I read it twice before passing the phone to Daniel. He glanced at it, his eyes flicking back to mine, that same quiet smile deepening. No words were necessary. The drive back toward the coast felt different than every other trip I'd made along that stretch of highway. The ocean came into view, glittering under the afternoon sun, and for the first time in years I didn't feel like I was chasing something beyond the horizon. I had already arrived. The weight that had pressed against me for so long was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt like freedom. Daniel reached over and laced his fingers with mine, his grip firm. Neither of us spoke, but I knew he felt it too, that this wasn't just the end of a fight. It was the start of a life entirely on our terms. And that more than the money or the verdict was the real victory. We moved into the new place on a fogless morning when the water lay flat as glass and the gulls skimmed so close to the surface their wingtips touched the shine. The house sat on a quiet stretch of sand in Santa Barbara, white stucco and wide windows that opened to the sound of the tide. The movers left by noon and the living room became a maze of boxes, each one marked in my handwriting. Daniel carried the last carton and smiling in that way that told me he could already see the life we were about to live here. We unpacked slowly, picking one room at a time. He set his records along the built-in shelves, lined up with the kind of care he brought to everything he loved. I stacked books by the window and rolled the rug flat with my feet, then stood back to look at the space and let it tell me what it wanted. By late afternoon, we had a couch facing the ocean, a throw draped over the arm, and 2 mugs sitting on the low table like they had always belonged there. News of the verdict had settled into a steady hum in the background. Headlines faded to footnotes and then to a few paragraphs in the business section. The scholarship paperwork moved ahead fast thanks to a dean at the local community college who met with us and lit up when we said we wanted students with grit rather than polished resumes. We chose a name that felt right, the Henry Whitmore Scholarship, and set the first awards for the fall. Daniel handled the legal setup while I drafted a short note about my grandfather to include in the application packet. Writing his name next to the word scholarship felt like setting a stone where something had once been stolen. There were quiet moments when the house itself seemed to breathe. Mornings when I took coffee onto the deck and watched the first paddleboarders slip across the bay. Afternoons when the marine layer came in and the light went pewter and soft. Evenings when Daniel grilled on the patio and we ate barefoot with the sliders open, the air smelling like salt and lemon. My phone stayed mostly face down. A few messages found me anyway. A short email from Robert that read like a legal memo rather than a note from a father. A text from Margot that made a case for perspective and family image. I did not reply. Ava tried once too, a longer message that circled every point but the truth. I read it once and put the phone away. There was no anger left to spend, only a boundary I did not intend to cross. Sophie visited on a Sunday bringing a small box of seashells she said had washed up near her shop after a storm. We sat at the kitchen island while the late sun turned the counters gold, and she told me the city had already moved on to the next story. She asked about the scholarship and smiled when I described the selection committee and the first-year target. Before she left, she squeezed my hand, and for a heartbeat I felt 17 again, seen by someone who never asked me to be smaller to make anyone else comfortable. The house began to collect evidence of a life being lived. Sand tracked in a line from the door to the sink. A grocery list taped to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a pelican. A pair of wet towels slung over the deck rail because we had run into the water without thinking to bring spares. Daniel started keeping a small notebook by the bed, scribbling ideas at odd hours for a project he had put off during the trial. I started running again, slow along the shoreline, the kind of pace that let my thoughts unspool without getting tangled. One evening, we drove up the hill to watch the sunset from a turnout that gave us the whole sweep of coast. The water took the light in slow bands, pink to orange to a brief gasp of red. Daniel talked about the first scholarship dinner and the students we would meet, how the money could be both a door and a vote of confidence. I listened and felt my chest loosen in a way I had not known it could. The future sounded like something we chose together rather than a set of obligations handed to us with strings. The letter found me again on a quiet Thursday. I had tucked my grandfather's note into the top drawer of the desk in our new bedroom, meaning to frame it when the right moment came. I pulled it out and sat on the edge of the bed with the window open to the sound of the tide. The paper was softer than I remembered, the ink still sure and unmistakably his. He wrote about trust and steadiness, about wanting his legacy to land where it would be cared for rather than displayed. He wrote that he hoped I would never trade my sense for someone else's approval. I read the lines twice and then a third time, and with each pass the tension I had not realized I was still carrying eased a little more. That was the mini climax I had not known I needed, a simple act with the weight of years inside it. I slid the letter back into its envelope and placed it in the top drawer again, not as something to hide but as something to keep close. For the first time, I felt sure I had done exactly what he asked of me without ever using the words to justify a single step. There were practical things too. The properties placed under injunction now required my consent for any move. Michael handled the paperwork with the same careful calm he had brought to the trial, and I signed only what aligned with what I wanted, not what would make anyone else comfortable. When the first distribution from the judgment cleared, Daniel and I took a walk on the beach and spoke out loud about where it would go. The scholarship came first. A reserve for a studio space where I could work with local artists came next. We drew a line at anything that looked like a performance for people who had confused money with worth. Every so often the past tried to press a hand against the window. A neighbor who had once known my parents would mention them at the farmer's market. A link would land in my inbox from someone convinced I had not seen the latest op-ed about legacy families and the price of scandal. I let those things drift past like kelp in the break. Each time I chose not to reach for them, I felt lighter. One morning I woke before the alarm and watched Daniel sleep, his hand relaxed on the sheet, the lines at the corner of his eyes softened. He opened one eye and smiled, then asked without words if I wanted coffee or 20 more minutes. I said coffee with a nod, and he laughed under his breath and went to the kitchen. That small exchange felt like proof that the life we had promised ourselves was not an idea. It was here, quiet and ordinary in the best way. We hosted a small dinner the night before the scholarship announcement. Sophie came and two friends who had stayed when the crowd thinned. We ate grilled fish and a salad I made with peaches and torn basil, and someone opened a bottle of wine we had been saving. When the plates were cleared, Daniel spoke for a minute about the fund and about making good come from something that had started with harm. I said only that I was grateful to stand where I was standing and to choose where we went next. No speeches, no performance, just a room full of people who already knew the shape of what mattered. Later, after everyone left and the house went quiet again, I walked out to the water with my feet bare. The shoreline glowed with the last light and the sand cooled fast once the sun slipped away. I stood with the waves lapping at my ankles and let the cold bite climb to my calves. There was no bitterness in me, no itch to reopen the wound and show anyone how deep it had once gone. What I felt was a clean edge where the past ended and the rest of my life began. When I turned back toward the house, Daniel was on the deck, one hand lifted in a small wave. I climbed the steps and took the towel he held out. We didn't talk about what had happened anymore unless it served a purpose. We talked about the garden we wanted along the side fence, and the dog we might adopt after the scholarship dinner, and the trip we would take in the spring to a place with bright markets and streets that were easy to get lost in. If you have ever stood where I stood and felt the ground tilt under you, when the people who should have held you up chose to push you aside, I hope this story gives you a little steadiness. If you have watched justice arrive slowly and then all at once, or if you are waiting for your own version of it to appear, I would love to hear what that looked like for you. Share your story in the comments so others can find the courage to draw their own lines. If this journey meant something to you, stay with the channel, subscribe, and tap like so more people who need a story like this can find it.